The sun was a crack of blood on the eastern rim of the world, spilling liquid fire over the sandstone mesas of Coyote Steppe. The light did not bring warmth, not yet. It only brought color to the cold, turning the high desert from a thing of gray shadow into a landscape of brutal, magnificent red. Below, the air was still sharp with the memory of the night's frost, carrying the scent of dust, dry sage, and the faint ammonia tang of distant cattle. Jonah Rook felt the chill in his knuckles. He kept his hands gloved, but after 20 years in this territory, the cold found the old breaks in his bones. He rode hunched, a habit born of grief as much as weather, his gaze scanning the herd of longhorns moving before him. They were a motley bunch, lean from a hard winter, but they were his. They were the sum of the 5 years he had lived alone on Dry Lantern Ridge. The 5 years since the diphtheria had come through and taken Mary, and then little Sarah, leaving him with nothing but the silence and the rock. The silence was his companion. It was in the steady, hollow clack of his horse's hooves on the packed earth, the weary sigh of the wind through the juniper, the lowing of the cattle. He herded them toward the small box canyon that served as his holding pen, his movements economical, his thoughts as quiet and worn as the leather of his saddle. It was a routine, a liturgy of survival that kept the past at bay by filling the present with the necessary work. Then the silence broke. It was not a loud noise. It was a sound that did not belong. A strained, rhythmic groan, like new rope taking a weight it was not meant to hold. It was followed by a sharp, whistling tear as the high desert wind caught something and was forced to cut around it. Jonah reined in his horse, a bay gelding named Ghost, who flicked his ears toward the sound. The cattle ambled on, oblivious. Jonah's eyes scanned the rise to his left, a knot of ocotillo and broken rock. The sound came again, a creak, a snap, and that awful, whistling sigh. He turned Ghost, his hand moving not to the Winchester in its scabbard, but to the handle of the skinning knife on his belt. A gun was for a fight, a knife was for work. This felt like some terrible, unfinished work. He left the trail, pushing Ghost through the brittle scrub. He followed the noise, but also the signs. A string of fresh broken shola, their spine segments scattered on the ground as if something heavy had been dragged through. A saguaro with a long, raw scar down its arm, the white pulp exposed. He was moving into a shallow draw, a place the wind worried and spun, a natural trap for tumbleweeds and bad business. He found it 50 yards later. Against the red backdrop of the rising sun, 2 rough-hewn cottonwood posts had been rammed into the ground, braced by a third beam lashed across the top. It was a crude frame, a gallows made by an idiot, or a butcher. From the center of the crossbeam, a figure hung. It was a girl. She was suspended upside down, her ankles bound tight with new manila rope, the fibers still stiff. Her body was limp, swaying slightly in the wind that created the whistling sound he had heard. Her hair, a fall of black so long it almost brushed the ground, was matted with sand and bits of debris. Her eyes were closed, the skin of her face a pale, bluish-gray under a mask of dust. Her breath was a thing he saw rather than heard, a faint, stuttering pulse in her chest. Jonah dismounted before Ghost had fully stopped. He took in the scene with a cold, rising fury that burned the frost from his lungs. This was not a quick death. This was a message. He saw the words scrawled across the front of her homespun cotton tunic, a pale brown garment now dark with sweat and dirt. The letters were smeared in thick, greasy charcoal. Trespasser! Her bare feet, dangling near his eye level, were a testament to her struggle. The soles were raw, blistered and purpled from the hot sand and sharp gravel she must have been forced across. Her wrists, he now saw, had been bound high above her head, which was now low, but the ropes had been cut, leaving bloody abrasions. They had tied her by the wrists first, he reckoned, then changed their minds and strung her up by the ankles, leaving her to die by the slow drowning of her own blood. He did not call out. There was no one to hear but the wind, and the girl was beyond hearing. He grabbed the rough side of the cottonwood post and pulled himself up. The structure was flimsy, clearly built in a hurry. He balanced on the crossbeam, the girl's body twisting slowly below him. He pulled his cattle knife. It was a simple tool, worn smooth with use, but the blade was sharp enough to shave with. He reached down, grabbed the rope above her ankles to steady her, and cut. There was no grace in it. She fell. He had expected her weight, but not the sheer, boneless inertia. She collapsed into him, a dead weight that struck him in the chest, almost knocking him from the beam. He grunted, wrapping one arm around her waist, the other still holding the knife. She felt like a sack of wet grain, heavy, damp, and lifeless. He slid down the post, taking her with him, the friction burning his hands through his gloves. He landed hard, his knees buckling, and eased her to the ground. He knelt beside her, his knife already back in its sheath. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, under the jawline, searching for a pulse. His own heart was a hammer in his chest. He felt nothing. He cursed, a low, rasping breath, and shifted his fingers, pressing harder against the cold skin. There! It was thin as a spider's silk, a fragile tap-tap-tap that was more a memory of life than life itself. But it was there. She was alive. He moved quickly. His canteen was half full. He gently lifted her head, pouring a few drops of water onto her cracked lips. They did not part. He moistened his own neckerchief and wiped the grime from her mouth and nose. He had to get her out of the sun. His ranch was miles away. Too far. He looked around, his mind racing. The old line cabin by the dry well. It was only a mile south. It was shelter. He stood, pulling off his heavy wool poncho. He wrapped her in it, covering her from the sun and the grit that was already beginning to swirl as the morning wind picked up. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, a bird-boned creature wrapped in a too large shroud. He carried her to Ghost, who snorted at the unfamiliar smell, the coppery scent of blood, and the faint, sweet odor of yucca. Easy, boy, Jonah murmured. He mounted, settling the girl across his lap, her head resting against his chest. He turned Ghost south, away from his herd, away from his home, and rode. The line cabin was little more than a lean-to against a slab of rock, with a dry well out front. The well had gone bad 3 years ago, but the cabin itself was still weather-tight. He laid her on the dusty cot inside, the poncho still wrapped around her. He went to the well. It was dry, but at the bottom, in the shade, he kept a small barrel of water for emergencies. He lowered the bucket and brought up a half-gallon of cool, clean water. He brought it inside. He set about cleaning her wounds with the methodical detachment of a man dressing a carcass. He tore strips from a clean flour sack he kept for engine grease. He washed the caked blood and sand from her ankles and wrists, from the cuts on her face, from the raw soles of her feet. Her skin was hot, her fever already starting to bake her. He tried to keep his mind empty, to focus on the task, the water, the cloth, the wound. But as he cleaned a long, shallow scratch on her temple, his hand froze, the line of her jaw, the dark, fine hair plastered to her skin. A ghost rose up in front of him. Sarah, his daughter. She would have been this girl's age. Near enough. He saw his own daughter's face, pale and listless in the grip of the fever, her breath coming in the same shallow rasps. He squeezed his eyes shut, his knuckles white on the wet cloth. He was a man who had failed to save his own. He had failed Mary, failed Sarah. He had buried them both in the same week, on the same hill, and a part of him had been buried with them. He opened his eyes. This was not Sarah. This was a stranger, and she was not dead yet. He finished washing her feet, his touch as gentle as he could make it. He propped her head up and managed to get a few more drops of water between her lips. This time, she swallowed. A groan, thin as her pulse, escaped her. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. They were dark, confused, and terrified. She tried to flinch away, but she had no strength. "You're safe," Jonah said. The words sounded rough, unused. "Water, just water." She stared at him, her gaze unfocused. Then, a flicker of understanding. She tried to speak. Her voice was a dry croak, a whisper of sand. "Tallulah," she breathed. "Tallulah Greyhawk." She seemed to be telling him her name, or the name of someone she needed. "Tallulah Greyhawk," she repeated, her eyes finding his, suddenly sharp, desperate. Don't let them touch the water ledger." She pushed herself up on one elbow. A sudden, impossible surge of strength. She grabbed the front of his shirt. "Copper Star Railway men," she gasped, her eyes wide. And Deputy Carlton." The strength fled as quickly as it came. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed onto the cot, unconscious once more. Jonah Rook stood slowly. He looked down at the girl, at the name branded on her tunic. Trespasser. He looked at the name she had given him. Tallulah Greyhawk. He heard the other names. Copper Star Railway. Deputy Carlton. He walked out of the cabin into the full morning light. The sun was higher now, a hard, yellow eye in a pale blue sky. He looked north, toward his home. Then he looked east, toward Pennant's Bluff. He could see them from here. Small, bright flags, planted in a neat line, stark against the red rock. They were new, planted in the last week. They marked the path of the coming railroad, the Copper Star. Jonah Rook stood by the dry well, a stranger in his cabin, a dead herd on his ranch, and the name of a corrupt lawman on his lips. He knew, with the certainty of a man who knows the shape of a coming storm, that he had not just cut a girl down, he had just chosen a side. And the wind was already rising. The smell of yucca root and stale wood smoke pulled her from the dark. Tallulah Greyhawk opened her eyes to a ceiling she did not know. Rough-hewn pine beams dark with soot. She was lying on a cot, the mattress stuffed with straw that rustled as she moved. She was not upside down. She was not in the sun. She was alive. The pain came next, a hot, thrumming web that caught her ankles, her wrists, and her head. She tried to sit up, and a sharp spike of it drove her back down, a gasp tearing from her raw throat. "Easy." The voice was low, rough, like stones dragging. Jonah Rook was sitting in a chair in the corner, scraping mud from his boots with a knife. He did not look at her. He just kept scraping, the rhythmic rasp filling the small cabin. Tallulah's eyes darted. A one-room cabin, a stone fireplace, cold, a dry sink, a single rifle, a Winchester, resting on wooden pegs above the door. Her tunic was gone, replaced by a man's linen nightshirt that was ridiculously large. Her ankles and wrists were bound not by rope, but by clean, white strips of linen. A thick, pungent salve had been slathered over the rope burns. "Where?" she began, her voice a croak. He gestured with the knife toward a tin cup of water on the small table beside her. "Dry Lantern Ridge, my land." He paused. "You're safe from the sun." He did not say she was safe from anything else. She reached for the cup with a bandaged hand that trembled. He stood, his shadow falling over her, and brought the cup to her lips. She drank, the water so cold it hurt, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She drank it all. He went back to his chair, to his boots. The silence stretched, broken only by the scrape of his knife. "They'll come for you," she said, her voice stronger. "They'll have to find me," he replied, not looking up. "You found me." He stopped scraping. He looked at her then, his eyes a flat, pale gray, the color of a winter sky. They held no pity, just a deep, settled exhaustion. Why? It was the only question that mattered. Tallulah pushed herself up to a sitting position, ignoring the fire in her joints. She looked at this man, a widower by the look of the cabin. There was no woman's touch here, only the stark, clean lines of a life lived by necessity. No pictures, no cushions, no color, just wood, iron, and dust. "My family, the Greyhawks. We hold the rights to the Three Sisters Creeks," she said, her voice gathering strength from the words, from the simple, unassailable truth. By treaty, signed in 53, before the territory was even drawn. Jonah watched her. He said nothing. The Copper Star Railway needs that water. Their new line cuts right through Pennant's Bluff. They can't run a steam engine without a pumping station, And they can't build a station without water. Our water. She swung her legs over the side of the cot. The floor was cold against her blistered feet, but she planted them flat. They tried to buy the rights. My father told them no. They tried to get the territorial court to void the treaty. The judge told them no. So, she said, her voice hardening, they sent Deputy Marshal Seth Carleton. Jonah's head came up at the name. Carleton. A man who wore his badge like a brand. A man who believed the law was whatever he said it was at the top of his lungs. Carleton and his cousin. Tallulah continued. A man named Elliot Pike. He's the nephew of the Copper Star president. They came to the ranch. They said my father was harboring rustlers. They said I was interfering with federal commerce. They tore the place apart. She looked at her bandaged hands. They staged it, dragged me out to that draw, called me a trespasser on railroad land. Land that isn't theirs. They did it to make an example, to frighten my father, to break him. And you, Jonah asked. His voice was still flat. You want revenge. You want me to get my gun and ride with you. Tallulah met his gaze, and for the first time, Jonah saw the steel beneath the pain. Her eyes were dark, not with anger, but with a cold, clear focus. No, she said. Revenge is a fool's game. It's what they want. They want me to come back with a gun. Then they can call me an outlaw. And Carleton can shoot me down in the street. And it will all be legal. Elliot Pike will get his water. And my father's name will be mud. She shook her head. I don't want blood. I want my name cleared. And I want the water to stay where it belongs. By the law. Jonah looked away from her. He looked at the cold fireplace, at the empty peg on the wall where his wife's apron used to hang. He knew about loss. He had stood helpless as diphtheria ravaged his wife and child. A sickness he could not bargain with, intimidate, or shoot. He had failed them. He had failed to keep them alive, and in the 5 years since, he had sworn to never be responsible for anything living again. His cattle, his horse, they were just work. They were not attachments. This girl, with her talk of law and water, she was an attachment. She was a complication that threatened to pull him back into a world he had actively, painfully, abandoned. He had run from the world, and the world had just been hung upside down in his front yard. You're asking for a lot, he said, turning back to his boot. Law's a long way from here. The law's on paper, she said, her voice insistent. Jonah snorted. Paper burns. Then we need proof that's harder than paper. He finally stood, the boots forgotten. The question hung in the dusty air between them, sharp as a barb. If it's true, all of it, where's the proof? Larkspur Crossing, she said, without hesitation. The bank. My father kept a safe deposit box. Number 47G. It holds the original treaty, the territorial survey maps marking the creeks, and the tax receipts for every year since. Proof. A locked box in a bank. Jonah said, That's your plan. And how do you plan to open it? Tallulah's face clouded. She reached for her neck, her fingers grasping at the empty collar of the nightshirt. The key. It was on a necklace, a silver bead necklace my grandmother made when they pulled me from my horse. Pike tore it from my neck. He has it. He probably thinks it's just jewelry. Jonah was already shaking his head. So, the proof is locked in a bank, and the man who tried to kill you has the key. You don't have a plan, girl. You have a wish. No, she said. I have more. There's a man, an itinerant photographer. He's camped by the church in Fort Meridian. Bella Novak? He has a glass plate camera. If I can just get into that box, even for 5 minutes, a photograph of that map, of the treaty, would be undeniable. A copy they can't burn. A copy the law can't ignore. Jonah stared at her. The idea was audacious. It was desperate. It was also smart. He had seen the way people reacted to those new photographs. They looked at them like they were magic, like they were more real than the real thing. He walked to the door and pulled it open, letting the bright, cold morning air flood the cabin. The light made him wince. He needed to think. He needed to be sure. "Stay here," he said, and walked out. He saddled Ghost in silence, his mind turning over her words. Treaty, Carlton, Pike, a glass plate. He rode out, not toward the line cabin, but toward the draw where he had found her. It was just as he had left it. The sun was high now, baking the sand. The crude gallows stood stark against the sky. He dismounted and walked the ground, his eyes on the dirt, not on the structure. He found the tracks easily, preserved in the dry soil. 4, maybe 5 horses. They had come in hard and left fast. He knelt by the clearest set of prints. The shoe was heavy, military grade. But it was not the shoe that caught his eye. It was the mark it left in the center, a small, 5-pointed star, clean and deep. Jonah's breath hissed out. The star. Deputy Carlton's special issue horseshoes. A gift from a Pennsylvania ironworks. He'd said they were for superior traction. Everyone in the territory knew they were for marking his property, his trails, his authority. She was telling the truth. He stood there for a long time, the sun beating on the back of his neck. He looked at the gallows. He thought of his daughter, Sarah, and the fever. He thought of this girl, Tallulah, and the rope. The world had come for her, just as it had come for his family. He had been helpless then. He was not helpless now. When he returned to the cabin, Tallulah was standing, dressed in a pair of his old, too large denim trousers, rolled up at the ankles, and the linen shirt. She had found a comb and, despite the pain, had worked the knots from her hair. She looked less like a victim and more like a fighter. He didn't say what he'd found. He didn't need to. He just walked to the fireplace, took a piece of jerky from a pouch, and tossed it to her. She caught it. "We do this," Jonah said, his voice final. "We do it your way first. The law, the proof." He turned to face her, his pale eyes finally showing a spark of something other than grief. "But if the law fails, or if they come for us before the law gets here, we do it my way." Tallulah nodded, her dark eyes steady on his. "Proof first, violence last," he agreed. "But it has to be an option, only if we are forced, only to stay alive." She nodded again, a silent, binding contract made in the dusty, quiet cabin on Dry Lantern Ridge. It came not as a storm, but as a shroud, a cold. Fine mist began to fall just after dawn, clinging to Dry Lantern Ridge and turning the world into a palette of gray and brown. The rain was too weak to wash anything clean, but strong enough to seep into wood, wool, and bone. It was a miserable, waiting kind of weather, and it made the silence of the ranch feel even more isolated. Jonah was on the porch, nursing a cup of black coffee. When he saw them, they were just shapes at first. 4 riders emerging from the mist on the low trail, moving at a deliberate walk. There was no hurry in them. They knew where they were going. He did not move, but his shoulders tensed. He watched them come, his gaze tracking over the familiar lines of the men. The one in the lead was Deputy Marshal Seth Carlton, his bulk made larger by a black oilskin duster that shed the rain. The badge on his chest was a dull, wet star. Beside him rode a man Jonah did not know, slighter, dressed in a tailored city coat that was already dark with damp and looked painfully out of place. The 2 men behind them were local hard cases, men who worked for wages from whoever paid, and whose hands always hovered near their hips. "Inside," Jonah said, his voice low, not turning his head. Behind him, in the cabin's shadow, Tallulah melted back from the window. The riders stopped 20 feet from the porch. The mist swirled around the horses' legs. The only sounds were the jingle of harness and the steady drip of water from the cabin's eaves. Carlton's men fanned out, their expressions bored, their eyes missing nothing. The star-shaped horseshoes of Carlton's mount pressed perfect, menacing marks into Jonah's yard. Carlton himself said nothing. He just sat his horse, his gloved hands resting on his saddle horn, his face unreadable under the brim of his hat. The man in the city coat spurred his horse forward a step. He was young, with a thin, pale face that looked unused to the sun or the wind. He looked at Jonah, at the small, solid cabin, with a kind of bored disdain. "Jonah Rook," the man said. His voice was high, clear, and carried the clipped accent of the East. "My name is Elliot Pike. I represent the Copper Star Railway." Jonah sipped his coffee. He did not invite them to dismount. Pike smiled, a thin, tight expression that did not involve his eyes. "We are looking for a piece of lost property, a trespasser, a young woman of native extraction. We have reason to believe you found her." "I found a girl half dead," Jonah said. His voice was flat. "Strung up on a frame, marked with your railroad's word." Pike's smile faltered for a second. "Then you understand the seriousness of her crime. She was interfering with the federally mandated construction of the railroad. She is a criminal, Mr. Rook, and harboring her, well, that makes you a criminal too." "She's on my land," Jonah said. "This high desert," Pike said, gesturing with a gloved hand. "It's a dangerous place, full of accidents. A man alone. It's easy to get hurt. A fall, a snake bite. Sometimes a lonely rancher is just found too late. It would be a tragedy." Jonah set his coffee cup down on the porch railing. The tin made a soft, definitive sound. He did not reach for the shotgun leaning just inside the door. He did not touch the pistol on his hip. He simply placed the pot of coffee beside the cup. It was a domestic, simple act. It was a sign that he was at home, that he was not moving, and that he was not afraid to offer them hospitality, or to refuse it. "My land's my land, Pike," Jonah said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the damp air. Inside, Tallulah was pressed against the rough sawn wall, a sliver of window between the curtain and the frame. She was not hiding. She was watching, her eyes, sharp as obsidian shards, missed nothing. She watched the man named Pike, his expensive coat, the nervous way his horse shifted. She watched Carlton, a statue of corrupt authority. And she watched the other two. One had a saddle with a tooled silver concho, a custom piece. The other had a fresh scar on his cheek. She took her charcoal pencil, the one she used for sketching, and on a piece of brown wrapping paper, she wrote Pike. "Carlton, silver concho, scar cheek, 10 o'clock, 4 riders." She was building her case, one detail at a time. "Water rights aren't a commodity," Jonah said, his voice cutting through Pike's impending speech. Pike actually laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "Mr. Rook, in the West, everything is a commodity. Land, gold, timber, water, even the law." He nodded pointedly toward Carlton, who merely spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the wet ground. "Give her to us. We will make sure your inconvenience is forgotten." "Get off my land," Jonah said. The air went taut. The man with the scar cheek shifted his hand to his holster. Carlton's eyes, which had been half closed, opened fully and fixed on Jonah. Pike's face went from pale to white with anger. "You are making a mistake, rancher. A fatal one." He yanked his horse's head around. "Seth," he snapped. Carlton just nodded. Once. He and Pike turned their horses, the other two falling in behind. They rode off the same way they had come, swallowed by the mist. But one of them, the man with the scar, lingered for a moment. He dismounted, pulled something from his saddlebag. It was a new, sharp-pointed survey stake, about 3 feet long. He walked to the center of Jonah's small yard, raised it high, and drove it deep into the hard-packed earth with a single, brutal shove. He then unwound a length of new manila rope, the same kind Jonah had cut from Tallulah's ankles, and tied it to the stake in a tight, neat noose. He mounted his horse and was gone. The threat hung in the air, more potent than words. A stake driven into his land, a noose waiting. Jonah Rook watched them disappear completely. The cabin was silent behind him. He could feel Tallulah's gaze on his back. He stepped off the porch. The mist was cold on his face. He walked to the center of the yard, to the stake. He looked at it. He looked at the rope. He did not pull it out. He placed his left boot against the base of the stake to brace it. He grasped the top with both hands. He did not strain. He was a man who knew his own strength. He simply drew a breath, set his shoulders, and bent. The sound of the wood snapping was as sharp and final as a gunshot in the damp air. He did not throw the pieces. He let them fall from his hands, one on either side of the hole. The message was sent. The message was received. He turned and walked back into the cabin, the heavy, wet air following him. He shut the door, and the small room was filled with the smell of old wood, coffee, and the yucca salve. Tallulah was standing by the table, her hands clenched. The paper with her notes was on the table. "They will come back," she said. It was not a question. "With more men, and they won't knock." "I know," Jonah said. He went to the stove, poured himself another cup of coffee. His hand was perfectly steady. "We cannot win a fight like that. Jonah, not a shooting fight. That is what they want. They kill me. They kill you. They burn the cabin. And Carlton writes a report about 2 outlaws resisting arrest. We cannot hide. So we run," Jonah said. But he knew the answer. "No," Tallulah said, her voice fierce. "We do not run. We do not hide. We do not fight. We win. We take the fight to them, but not on their terms. Pike said the law is a commodity. He is wrong. The truth is not. We have the truth. We just need to show it to someone they cannot buy, and someone who is not afraid to print it." Jonah stopped, the cup halfway to his lips. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was not a girl. She was a woman, forged in a fire he was only just beginning to understand. He nodded slowly. "We need an ally, someone who knows the law, someone with a voice, someone who can read," Tallulah said, "and who owns a printing press." The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, dangerous purpose. They were both thinking of the small, dusty town of Fort Meridian, and the one person who served God and the written word with equal, unbending fervor. "Reverend Editor May Hollister," Jonah said. "The Meridian Bell," Tallulah added, a thin, hard smile touching her lips for the first time. "They say she fears God, but nothing else. Then that's where we ride." Jonah said, setting his cup down. "Not tonight. The mist will hold. But at first light, we take the truth to the bell." The First Congregational Church of Fort Meridian was a stark, white lie. It was a simple clapboard box with a tall steeple, pretending at New England piety while baking in the high desert sun. But the real religion, the one that moved the town, was practiced in the building behind it. The print shop of the Meridian Bell was a long, low-slung shed, part barn, part blacksmith's shop. The air inside was thick with the sharp, metallic smell of lead, the sweet, sour tang of ink, and the dusty scent of paper. It was a place of machinery and noise. A large, flatbed press, a behemoth of black iron, dominated the center of the room. Cases of type lined the walls. A library of letters, each one a potential bullet or a potential shield. Reverend Editor May Hollister fit the room. She was a tall, raw-boned woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her high cheekbones. She wore a printer's ink-stained apron over a severe black dress. Her eyes, magnified by small, steel-rimmed spectacles, were the sharpest things in the room. She had listened to Tallulah's story without a single interruption, her hands methodically sorting lead spacers into a wooden tray. Jonah stood by the door, a silent, grim guardian, his presence making the small shop feel crowded. When Tallulah finished, her voice raw, May did not offer platitudes. She did not quote scripture. She simply slid the last piece of lead into its slot with a soft click. "Deputy Marshal Seth Carlton," May said, her voice a dry, flat monotone. "A boil on the backside of the law. And Elliot Pike. I have read his letters to the Territorial Commission. He writes with the kind of arrogance that only Eastern money can buy." She wiped her inky fingers on a rag. "You were right to come here. They have paper. We will have paper. They have threats. We will have facts." She crossed the room not to a desk, but to a heavy, lead-lined chest that Jonah assumed held her most valuable type. Instead, She lifted a false bottom, revealing not lead, but a hidden compartment. From it, she removed a bottle of dark India ink, a fresh set of steel-nibbed pens, and a smooth, polished plate of zinc. "They have made 2 mistakes," May said, placing the items on her composing stone, a thick slab of marble. "First, they left you alive, Tallulah. Second, they think their fight is with your father." She looked at Jonah. "They do not know about you." And she tapped the zinc plate. "They do not know about me." The plan came together quickly, not as a whisper, but as a series of hard, practical declarations. The bank in Larkspur Crossing, the safe deposit box, number 47G. "We can't get the key," Tallulah said, her frustration clear. "Pike has it. Then the key is irrelevant," May stated. "The lock is steel. The door is steel. We are not dynamiters, but the contents are paper." "The photograph," Jonah said, speaking for the first time. "The man you mentioned, Novak." "Bela Novak," May confirmed. "He is camped in the churchyard. He is a man of science, not faith, but he respects our peace. He has a wagon, a dark room, he calls it, and a camera, a wet plate camera." "We go in," Tallulah said, her eyes bright with a sudden, sharp hope. "Tomorrow night, after the bank closes, we get into the vault, find the box." "And if it's locked?" Jonah asked. "The bank manager, Mr. Hennessy, keeps the duplicate keys for all boxes in his desk drawer," May said. "He is a man of precise, foolish habits. He also keeps a bottle of whiskey in that same drawer. He will be at the saloon by 9 o'clock. We don't need Pike's key. We just need Hennessy to be himself." "So we open the box," Tallulah said, "and I find the map. And Mr. Novak photographs it." May finished. "A glass plate negative, a perfect, undeniable copy of the treaty and the survey, a fact they cannot burn, a fact they cannot deny." The first stop was Bela Novak. They found him by his wagon, a strange, top-heavy vehicle painted a light, flaking blue. He was a small, fussy man with a magnificent black mustache and a permanent look of anxiety. He was boiling something over a small chemical stove, and the air smelled of ether. He listened, polishing a lens with a soft cloth, his head cocked. "This is not my affair," he said when May had finished. "I am an artist. I document. I do not participate." "Mr. Pike and his railroad will not respect the difference," May said coolly. "When they own the water, they will own this town, and they will not want witnesses documenting their work. They will run you out. Or worse." Bela looked at his wagon, his precious, delicate home. "Protect my wagon," he said, his voice small. "If there is trouble, you swear you will protect my equipment." "You have my word," Jonah said. The promise, coming from his deep, quiet voice, seemed to settle the matter. "Tomorrow," Bela sighed, "I will lend you the camera, the tripod, 2 plates. But you must learn the process. It is not magic, it is chemistry, and it is unforgiving." The rest of the day was a blur of hurried, frantic preparation. The print shop became a war room. Jonah, a man whose hands were calloused by leather, wood, and iron, found himself in the back shed, which May used for dark storage. Bela Novak, with the impatient, precise instruction of a master, was teaching him how to pour collodion. In the dark, "Mr. Rook, it must be done in the dark," Bela hissed, though they were in the dim shed. "The plate is only sensitive to light after it has been in the silver nitrate bath. You pour the collodion. So, a steady hand, corner to corner. Do not let it dry. Do not breathe on it now. Into the silver. For 3 minutes. Not 2, not 4, 3. Jonah's large, rough hands fumbled with the glass plate. The first one he coated was a mess of streaks and bubbles. The second he dropped. "This is not a horseshoe," Bela snapped. "I see that," Jonah growled, picking up a third plate. He closed his eyes, remembering the feel of the liquid, the weight of the glass. He poured, tilted, and drained, all in one smooth, practiced motion, as if he were feeding a sick calf. Ah, Bella said, surprised. Perhaps there is hope. Meanwhile, Tallulah was at the composing stone with May. She had a piece of slate and a chalk pencil. From memory, May instructed. Draw the symbols, the marker for the North Spring, the symbol for the old channel, the surveyor's signature. Tallulah's hand was swift and certain. She was not just practicing. She was arming herself. She was the only one who could look at a dozen maps in a dark room and know, instantly, which one was the true one. She drew the small, stylized hawk that her grandfather had insisted the original surveyor add to the key, the gray hawk. Good, May said, nodding. Now, again. May herself was at the typecase. Her fingers flew, a blur of motion, plucking tiny, reversed letters of lead from their compartments. She was not setting a prayer. She was setting an editorial. She talked as she worked, the words a low, angry rhythm. Territorial water law, based on the Santa Fe precedent of 1861. Beneficial use does not mean corporate monopoly. The rights of prior appropriation, held by treaty, supersede the claims of commerce. She was building her weapon, one leaden letter at a time. By late afternoon, the block of type was locked and ready. It sat on the stone, a heavy, rectangular threat, waiting for the one thing it needed the proof. They planned the signals. If Carlton raids the town, May said. 3 rings from the church bell. Slow, a funeral toll. That means scatter, disappear. And the railroad, Jonah asked. His hands stained yellow from the silver nitrate. Pike's men are camped at the depot. If they move, they will move on the engine. 2 sharp whistles from the steam engine. Tallulah said, that is their signal to their crews. It will be our signal too. It means they know. It means we run. The escape route, Jonah said. He unrolled a small map of his own. A mental one. Not the main road. We go through Washout Gulch. The last flash flood cut a new cave under the north bank. We can hide the horses there, and ourselves, until they pass. As dusk fell, May went to her desk. She unlocked a drawer and took out a folded, official-looking document, blue paper with a red seal. What's that? Tallulah asked. A civil summons, May said, a thin smile playing on her lips. From Judge Horace Vale, down in the Capitol. He owes me for printing his re-election posters. This summons requests Mr. Elliot Pike's presence at a hearing to discuss public access to territorial waterways. It's just paper, but it's paper Carlton cannot ignore in broad daylight. It is our shield, if we need one. She had one last thing. She pulled a small, simple necklace of blue glass beads from the same drawer. For you, she said to Tallulah. Pike has your silver. He will be looking for it. Let him see this instead. Let him think you are still a grieving girl, looking for jewelry, a decoy. It will keep his eyes on your neck, and not on your hands. Tallulah took the necklace. It was cool and smooth, a fake, a lure. She put it on. The 3 of them stood in the center of the print shop. The plan was laid. The tools were ready. The air was thick with chemicals, ink, and a new, dangerous resolve. Jonah Rook picked up his rifle from where it leaned against the door. He checked the action. His movements economical and final. We go in. We get the plate. We get out, he said. He looked at Tallulah, then at May. His voice was low, and it was the last word on the matter. No shooting first. We don't go for revenge. We only shoot to live. The sky broke at 9 o'clock. It was not a gentle shower, but a cold, driving downpour that turned the dusty streets of Larkspur Crossing into rivers of mud. The wind came with it, howling down from the high passes, making the few lit lanterns that hung from the storefront swing in wild, erratic arcs. The light, slick and yellow on the wet boardwalks, was treacherous, full of deep, moving shadows. This was the cover they had been waiting for. May Hollister, wrapped in a heavy oilskin cloak that looked more suited to a sea captain, marched up the front steps of the Larkspur First National Bank. It was 10 minutes to closing. She slammed the door open, letting a gust of wind and rain chase her inside. scattering a stack of withdrawal slips. Mr. Hennessy, the teller and manager, a small man with a perpetually worried expression, looked up in alarm. "Reverend Hollister, we are just about to close the—" "Closing," May's voice boomed, cutting through the sound of the storm. "You are closing your doors on fiscal responsibility. Mr. Hennessy, I am here about these railroad bonds of 5% return. You said 5%. It is highway robbery, sir. And I have the circular right here to prove it." She began pulling sheafs of paper from her reticule, her voice rising in a magnificent, calculated fury. Hennessy, trapped behind his own grill, looked like a mouse cornered by a hawk, while the storm raged on the main street. A second, quieter storm was happening in the alley behind. The service door was set deep in a brick alcove, shielded from the worst of the rain. Jonah Rook worked the simple pin-and-tumbler lock with a piece of stiff wire. He was not a thief, but he was a rancher. And a man who has fixed a broken seating drill in the dark can open any simple lock made by man. The click of the lock was absorbed by the roar of the rain. He pushed the door open. It complained with a low, scraping groan. He and Tallulah slipped inside, into the pitch blackness of the bank's back room. Jonah closed the door, sealing them in a world that smelled of cold iron, floor wax, and ledgers. From the front of the bank, they could hear May's voice, now debating the finer points of territorial interest law. "This way," Tallulah whispered. Her hand found his sleeve. She had been in this bank with her father. She knew the layout. They moved past stacks of canvas coin bags, past a heavy oak desk, and through a second door. They were in the main hall. A single oil lamp burned on Hennessy's desk, casting long shadows that danced with the ones from the swinging lanterns outside. May's loud, indignant tones gave them all the cover they needed. Jonah went to the desk. "Drawer," he whispered. Tallulah pointed. "The bottom right." Jonah slid it open. It was just as May had said. A bottle of whiskey, half empty, and a heavy brass ring holding a dozen duplicate keys. The vault was at the back of the room. A massive, black-painted steel door. The handle was unlocked, as it would be until H_Hennessy_ closed for the night. Jonah pulled it open. The hinges were silent, oiled. Inside, the air was dead and cold. Tallulah lit a small, green-filtered dark lamp, the kind Bella Novak had provided. It cast a sickly, aquatic glow, just enough to see. The walls were lined with small, numbered brass doors. 47G, she whispered, her voice trembling, her fingers tracing the numbers. "Here." Jonah stepped forward with the ring of keys. He tried the first one that looked right. It did not fit. He tried a second. It slid in but would not turn. "It's rusted," he muttered. He tried a third, forcing it. The key grated but held fast. "Damn it," Tallulah's breath hitched. All this for a stubborn lock. "Wait," Jonah said. His mind was working. "Hennessy, the whiskey." He looked back at the main room. "He'll be in here for it before he leaves. We can't wait." He looked at the box. "We don't need the box. We just need the map." He pulled his kettle knife. "Stand back." He wedged the tip of the heavy blade into the seam of the small door. He put his shoulder against the wall, got his leverage, and gave a single, powerful, silent push. The brass was soft. The lock mechanism, designed only to keep honest men honest, popped. The door sprang open. Tallulah reached inside, her hands shaking, and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, a small stack of papers tied in ribbon, and a rolled oilcloth tube. "This," she breathed, untying the tube. She unrolled it on the floor. It was the map. Even in the dim green light, they could see the clean lines of the surveyor, the markings for the Three Sisters Creeks, and the small, proud drawing of a hawk in the legend. "Photograph it," Jonah said. They worked as a single, desperate machine. Jonah unfolded the tripod. Tallulah, her hands now steady, clamped the camera in place. Jonah pulled the prepared glass plate from its light safe box, the air filling with a sharp smell of collodion and ether. He slid it into the camera. "Hold the map flat," he ordered. Tallulah knelt, Her fingers spread on the corners of the oilcloth. Jonah aimed the lens, uncapped it, and struck a match. He lit a magnesium flare, which erupted with a brilliant, blinding white light. It hissed, smoked, and was done in 3 seconds. "Got it," he said, capping the lens. And then they heard it. It was not May's voice. It was not Hennessy. It was the sound of the front door opening again, and the heavy, solid, unmistakable tread of spurred boots on the wooden floor. Jonah and Tallulah froze. The sound of the rain outside seemed to fade, replaced by the pounding in their chests. The footsteps stopped. They heard a low, male voice, then Hennessy's, high and nervous. "Marshal Carlton, I didn't expect—" A heartbeat later, a sound, clang, clang, clang. It came from the wall, from the heating pipe that ran from the front office. May's signal. "Danger! Get out!" "He's here," Tallulah whispered. "Go," Jonah said. He didn't grab the plate. He grabbed the entire camera, tripod and all, and shoved it into her arms. The alley. He turned and blew out the green lamp, plunging the vault into absolute blackness. They stumbled out of the vault, just as a light appeared in the main room. Carlton, holding a lantern high. "Hennessy, you check the vault. Sounded like it came from back here." Jonah didn't hesitate. He grabbed Tallulah's arm and pulled her toward the back door. They burst out into the alley, into the roaring, wet chaos of the storm. "There!" A shout went up, not from the bank, but from the end of the alley. 2 of Pike's men, Scarcheek and Silver Concho, waiting. A shot cracked, the muzzle flash illuminating the rain in a spray of orange. Jonah shoved Tallulah. "Run toward the gulch." They fled. The street was a nightmare of sucking mud and dark. Unfamiliar shapes. Tallulah, burdened with the awkward, heavy tripod, nearly fell. Jonah grabbed her, half lifting her as they ran. Behind them, more shouts. Carlton, bursting from the bank. "Stop them! It's the girl!" The town was alive with noise. Boots pounding on the boardwalk, men yelling, the steady, terrifying roar of the rain. Suddenly, the sky lit up, not with lightning, but with a cold, pale chemical light. A railroad flare arced over the town, fired from the depot. It cast long, dancing shadows, illuminating them as they staggered across the main street. A second later, the sound they had dreaded. 2 sharp, piercing whistles from the steam engine at the depot. Pike's men were moving. The whole town was now their prison. "This way!" Jonah bellowed over the wind. He knew the edge of town. He knew the land. They reached the end of the street, where the ground fell away into Washout Gulch. In the dry season, it was a ditch. Tonight, it was a churning brown river. Their horses were hidden 50 yards down, but their pursuers were already on horseback. The sound of hoofbeats, even in the mud. Growing closer. "They're on us!" Tallulah cried. Jonah saw them. 3 riders, Carlton and 2 others, silhouetted by the flare's dying light. He also saw, at the edge of the livery yard, a stack of heavy, empty water barrels, held back by a single, fraying rope. He didn't slow down. He ran straight for the rope, his knife already in his hand. He didn't saw. He slashed. The rope snapped. The thunder of the barrels was a hollow, chaotic avalanche. They rolled, bounced, and scattered down the muddy incline, directly into the path of the oncoming horses. A horse screamed, a high, terrifying sound. As it reared, there were shouts, curses, the crash of wood on wood, and the heavy, sickening sound of a horse and rider going down in the mud. "Now!" Jonah grabbed Tallulah's hand. They plunged into the darkness, sliding down the muddy bank toward the sound of the flood. He pulled her past their horses, hidden in a stand of cottonwoods, and straight into a curtain of blackness, a new-cut cave, carved by the last flood. They fell inside, landing on damp sand. They were in total darkness, the only sound the roar of the floodwater just feet away and the frantic, gasping thunder of their own breathing. Outside, they could hear Carlton yelling, his voice raw with fury. "Find them! Get lights down here! They're on foot!" They were soaked, frozen, caked in mud. Tallulah was still clutching the camera, holding it against her chest like a child. "The plate," Jonah said, his voice a raw whisper. "Is it? I think so," she panted. He felt her shift, protecting it, tucking it under the tattered remains of his poncho that she still wore. They huddled back against the cold, wet rock, praying the darkness would hold them. In the blackness of the cave, blind and hunted, Jonah's hand, fumbling to check the camera's legs, brushed hers. Her fingers were like ice, and they were trembling, not from cold, but from sheer, terrified exhaustion. He did not pull away. He simply closed his hand over hers, his calloused, steady palm covering her knuckles. She did not pull away either. Her fingers gripped his, a silent, desperate, steel-hard grip. They said nothing. They just stayed there, in the dark. A man who had lost everything and a woman who had nothing left, holding on, while the storm and the hunt raged outside. For hours, they did not move. They sat in the pitch-black, damp cold of the cave, listening as the hunt raged outside. They heard Carlton's men shouting, their voices thin and angry against the roar of the floodwater. They saw the beam of a lantern sweep across the cave's mouth once, a yellow eye that found nothing but a wall of rain. Then, slowly, the sounds of the pursuit faded, moving farther down the gulch, toward the main crossing. Finally, there was nothing but the storm. The relentless, drumming rain and the churning water were the only sounds in the world. Jonah let go of her hand, and the loss of warmth was immediate. Tallulah felt a chill, deeper than the rain, begin to creep in. "He's gone," Jonah whispered. His voice was just a vibration in the dark. "For now," she whispered back. "Stay here. The plate." He felt his way to the front of the cave, to the camera. He gently unlatched the back, his calloused fingers surprisingly delicate. He slid the single, precious glass plate out, wrapped it in the oilcloth from his own pocket, and tucked it deep inside his shirt, against his skin. "We need light," he said, "and warmth, or we won't live to see morning." He had a tinderbox and a small, dry bundle of tinder shredded juniper bark in a waxed pouch. He felt his way to the back of the cave, where the sand was drier. He found a few pieces of driftwood, miraculously dry, left from a previous flood. He struck his flint. The spark was a tiny, defiant star in the immense darkness. It caught the tinder, which smoldered, and then, with a gentle breath, bloomed into a small, weak flame. He fed it the smallest twigs, nurturing it, his face cast in a stark, flickering orange. The fire was tiny, no bigger than his hand, but it was the most beautiful thing Tallulah had ever seen. It pushed the absolute darkness back, creating a small, breathing space of dim, golden light. Jonah sat back on his heels, his work done. The firelight caught the exhaustion in his face, the deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. He looked at Tallulah. She was a wreck of mud and wet cloth, her hair plastered to her face, her hands, raw from the cold, clasped in her lap. She was shivering, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that she could not control. He said nothing. He simply stood, pulled his own wool coat from his saddle roll, the one thing he'd managed to grab from his horse, and walked over to her. He draped the heavy, damp-smelling coat over her shoulders. It was huge, enveloping her, and it smelled of him of leather and smoke, and the faint, clean scent of sage. She looked up, her eyes wide, and he sat down beside her on the dry sand, close enough to share the meager warmth of the fire, but not touching. "You're shaking," he said. "So are you," she replied. He held his own hands up to the fire. They were steady. "No, I'm not. On the inside," she said, her voice so low he barely heard it over the rain. They sat in silence. The fire crackled, a companionable sound. The sound of the rain was a drumbeat, a wall of sound that sealed them into their small, dark space. It was no longer a threat. It was a curtain. He shifted, and his shoulder brushed hers. The contact was electric, a sudden, solid point of warmth. Neither of them pulled away. The small, incidental touch anchored them. The warmth from his side began to seep through the wool coat, a slow, life-giving heat that calmed the shivers. The firelight played over her face. He watched the way it caught the high line of her cheekbone and the stubborn, proud curve of her jaw. She had been through a terror that would have broken most men. She had been hunted, strung up, and chased through a storm. And yet, she was here. She was whole. She turned her head, slowly, and met his gaze. Her eyes, in the firelight, were not black, but a deep, clear brown. They were not filled with fear. They were steady and searching, and held a quiet, heartbreaking gentleness that he had not seen before. It was the look of someone who had seen the worst and had decided to live anyway. "You lost them," she said. "We lost them," he corrected. She looked at the fire. "My father, he made me promise. He said the water was the blood of the land, that it didn't belong to us. We just had to keep it safe for everyone. He said it was a promise older than our names." She paused, her voice thick. "I thought I had failed him. In the bank. I thought I had failed." Jonah found himself speaking, his own voice sounding rusty and strange with confession. "My wife, Mary, and my daughter, Sarah, diphtheria. It came fast. I was helpless. I just watched. I'm a man who can fix a fence, break a horse, build a house, and I could do nothing." He stared into the small flames, seeing other, more terrible fires. "When I found you, hanging on that frame, I saw her. I saw Sarah, and I thought I was going to fail again." He had not spoken these words to anyone. He had barely allowed himself to think them. Tallulah's hand, still cold, moved across the few inches of sand between them. It did not grab or clutch. It simply rested, lightly, on the back of his skin was rough, calloused, and warm. It was the first intentional, gentle touch either of them had offered. He turned his hand over, slowly, and his fingers closed around hers. The moment stretched. The rain, the fire, the darkness. It all seemed to center on that single, simple point of contact. He looked at her, and she looked back, and a silent, profound understanding passed between them. He leaned in. She did not lean away. He moved slowly, giving her every chance to turn, to stop. His other hand came up, his rough fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb gently wiping a smudge of mud from her cheek. And then he did what he had not done in 5 years. He reached for someone. He put his arms around her, pulling her from the cold sand and into him. It was not a violent motion, but a gathering. He pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her back, holding her tight, holding her safe. Tallulah's breath hitched, a small, half-broken sob. She did not fight. She melted. Her own arms, trapped in the heavy coat, found their way around his waist. She clung to him, pressing her face into the rough wool of his shirt. And for the first time since Carlton had ridden onto her ranch, she let go. She let herself be held. It was a long, deep, and profoundly safe embrace. It was not about desire. It was about sanctuary. They were two people who had been utterly alone, and suddenly were not. They breathed together, their heartbeats, frantic from the chase, from the confession, from the touch, began to slow, to find a matching rhythm. His chin rested on the top of her head. He could feel the fine silk of her hair against his skin. She tilted her head back to look at him. His face was inches from hers. The firelight was in his eyes, the pale gray of them now warmed and deep. The kiss came as slowly as the embrace. It was a question he asked, and a question she answered. His lips were chapped and tasted of coffee and the storm. He was gentle, so gentle, as his mouth covered hers. It was not a kiss of fire, but of warmth. It was a kiss that spoke of comfort and of finding shelter. It was long and slow, and it sealed out the cold and the fear. Her hand, which had been on his chest, slid up to his neck, her fingers tangling in the damp hair at his collar. His arm tightened, pulling her impossibly closer, until there was no space, no cold, no fear, left between them. The sound of the rain seemed to weave into the kiss, a private, drumming music. His other hand moved up, his palm cupping the back of her head, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world, which, to him, in that moment, she was. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. They did not move away. They just rested their foreheads together, their eyes closed. They voluntarily leaned into each other, shifting closer on the single leather saddle blanket he had spread. They sat side by side, his arm still around her, her head finding the natural, perfect place on his shoulder. They whispered names, not in passion, but in quiet discovery. Jonah, Tallulah, names that were now prayers against the dark. The small flame flickered, casting shadows that danced over their still forms, and then softened, veiling the new-formed peace between them. The dawn came not as a sound, but as a change in the quality of the darkness. The blackness of the cave's mouth slowly turned to a deep, pearlescent gray. The rain had stopped, leaving only the sound of dripping water and the distant rush of the gulch. Tallulah woke first. She was warm. She was wrapped in Jonah's coat, and his arm was still draped protectively over her. She had not been running. She had been sleeping. Jonah stirred as she moved, his body tensing, his hand instantly going to the knife on his belt. Then he saw her, his eyes focused, and the tension left him. He was awake. They looked at each other in the new, clean light of morning. There was no awkwardness. There was no regret. They were two people who had seen the dawn, a dawn they had not been sure they would. Tallulah looked at the small, leather-wrapped plate by his side. "We have it," she said. She smiled, a slow, real smile that lit her entire face. She looked at him, her hand finding his. No one can take what we hold together. Jonah's hand, which had held hers in the dark, held it now in the light. He gave her a nod, a small, private gesture that was as binding as any vow. "From now on," he said, his voice as steady as the rock around them. "Not alone." The sun was not yet 2 hours old when the first copies of the Meridian Bell hit the street. It was not the regular weekly. It was a single-sheet special edition, printed on one side, the ink still tacky. May Hollister had worked through the dawn, her small press clanking and sighing, turning the night's victory into a public weapon. She had set the type herself. Her editorial, the one she had prepared, was the lead. A question of water, a question of law. But beneath it, dominating the page, was the real cannon shot. Bella Novak, working with a feverish intensity, had made a perfect, sharp etching from the glass plate negative. Now, printed for all to see, was the map. The lines were clear. The 3 creeks, the boundaries, the official survey stamp, and the tiny, elegant hawk in the legend. And above it, May had set one devastating line of type, "The Copper Star Railway by what right?" May did not sell the paper. She gave it away. She handed copies to the ranchers coming in for supplies. She left a stack at the livery, at the general store, and at the public well. The effect was not a thunderclap. It was a rising murmur, a low, angry hum. It was the sound of a town waking up. Men who had been quiet, men who ran small herds and relied on the public well, gathered in knots. They passed the paper from hand to hand, their fingers tracing the lines of the map. It was their water. It was the water their parents had found, the water that kept the town from being just another patch of sun-baked rock. They looked from the paper to the new raw scar on Pennant's Bluff, and their faces hardened. Elliot Pike was eating breakfast in the dining room of the Larkspur Hotel when his man, Scarcheek, brought him a copy. Pike, in a clean shirt and tie, looked at the paper. He did not read it all. He just saw the map. His face, usually pale, when a blotchy, furious red, he did not put on his hat. He stormed out of the hotel, the paper crumpled in his fist, and marched to the train depot, which served as the Copper Star's local office. May, anticipating this, had left a stack of 50 copies on a bench outside. "Lies," Pike screamed, his voice cracking, the Eastern accent sharp and ugly in the morning air. "These are insurrectionist lies." He grabbed the stack of papers and threw them onto the muddy ground. He pulled a box of lucifers from his pocket, struck one, and tossed it onto the pile. The dry paper caught, the ink blistering. A plume of greasy, black smoke rose into the air. "This is what I think of your local traditions," he shouted. "To the town, to the sky." He did not know he was being watched. Bela Novak, from the upper window of the hotel, was not an artist this morning. He was a documentarian. He uncapped his lens and, with a flash of magnesium, captured a second, perfect, undeniable image, the agent of the Copper Star Railway, his face distorted in a mask of rage, burning a public newspaper in the center of town. The first act of war was over. The second began immediately. At 10 o'clock, Deputy Marshal Seth Carleton, his face a thundercloud, rode up to the print shop. He was not with Pike. He was with 4 of his own men, armed for trouble. Jonah Rook was on the porch, as if he had been waiting. "Jonah Rook," Carleton barked, not dismounting. "You are under arrest." "On what charge?" Jonah asked, his voice calm. "Breaking and entering, theft of private documents from the First National Bank, conspiracy to incite a riot." Carleton pulled a fresh warrant from his duster. "Now, are you coming quiet, or am I taking you in pieces?" "He is coming," May Hollister's voice rang out. She stepped onto the porch, holding not a rifle, but a book. It was a heavy, leather-bound copy of the territorial statutes. "But he is not coming quietly." Carleton's men moved to surround Jonah, their hands on their guns. Jonah slowly unbuckled his own gun belt and let it drop to the porch. He would not give them the excuse. As they tied his hands in front of him, May stepped into the street. A crowd was gathering, drawn by the smoke, by the shouting, by the law. "Marshal Carleton," May called, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "This warrant is illegal. You are arresting a man for retrieving evidence of a crime. Your crime?" "Shut your mouth, woman," Carleton snarled, yanking on the lead rope he'd attached to Jonah's cuffs. "I will not," May shouted, and she opened her book. "I cite the Santa Fe precedent, 1861, which guarantees access to water based on prior appropriation and treaty. I cite the Territorial Act of 1853, which validates all prior treaties. You are arresting a man for upholding the law you have sworn to enforce." She was reading, her voice ringing, as Carleton dragged Jonah down the main street. The crowd followed, silent, watchful. They saw Jonah, his head held high, and they saw May, marching at his flank like a righteous general, reading the law in a voice that would not be silenced. Carleton was in a box. He could not shoot an unarmed woman for reading. He could not disperse a crowd that was committing no crime. He was forced to walk, a prisoner of his own prisoner, while his authority was stripped away, one legal phrase at a time. He was almost to the jail when the second part of the plan unfolded. From the north end of town, a procession. It was Tallulah Greyhawk, but she was not alone. She was on horseback, and beside her rode Mr. Henderson, the owner of the public well, and 3 small ranchers whose lands bordered the creeks. Behind them walked a dozen more, shopkeepers, mothers, the blacksmith. They were not armed with guns. They were armed with shovels, pickaxes, and righteous anger. "Where are you going, girl?" Carleton yelled, his frustration boiling over. Tallulah reined in her horse. She looked at him, and her gaze was clear, cold, and held no fear. "We are going to Penance Bluff, Marshal. We are going to show these people the truth. We are going to show them the stone survey markers you told your men to cover. We are going to show them the ancient ditches your railroad is trying to fill. We are going to see the land the map describes." She was not asking. She was telling. And the crowd, seeing its choice, a corrupt marshal arresting a quiet man, or a brave woman showing them the truth, made its decision. The crowd around Carleton melted away, joining Tallulah's procession. "Stop them!" Elliot Pike was there, his face now sheet white with panic. He had a dozen new men with him, hired from the saloon, railroad security armed with shotguns. That is private property. Stop them. The new guards, led by Scarcheek, formed a line at the edge of town, blocking the road to Penance Bluff. They raised their shotguns. It was a line of armed men, paid by the railroad, facing down a crowd of unarmed citizens. The town held its breath. The standoff was absolute. A gun was cocked. A woman pulled her child back, and then, from the church, a sound. Bong! Every head turned. Bong! It was not the fast, frantic ring of an alarm. It was the slow, measured, funereal toll. But it was not the signal for scattering. It was 3 rings. Bong! Judge Horace Vale had arrived. He came in on the noon stage, a full day early. He was a small, bird-like man in a dusty suit, who looked more like a mortician than a hanging judge. He stepped from the coach into a town on the brink of a war. Marshal Carleton. His voice was thin, but sharp. What is the meaning of this? Why is your prisoner tied to a horse? Why is a private army blocking a public road? And why? He gestured to May. Is this woman shouting the territorial legal code at me? The tension did not break. It transformed. Your Honor, Pike said, stepping forward, his voice slick and smooth. A simple misunderstanding. This rancher was arrested for theft. And this woman, Tallulah's voice cut through, is here to claim her rights. Vale looked from Pike's tailored suit to Tallulah's determined face. He looked at the armed guards, and at the unarmed crowd. There will be no simple anything, Vale declared. This is a court of law, or it will be. We will settle this, now. He pointed not to the jail, not to the church. He pointed to the new half-finished train depot. We will hold this hearing at the scene of the dispute, in public, where every man can see the law at work. The trial was a dervish. It was held on the loading platform of the depot, with Judge Vale sitting on a crate of railroad spikes. The town stood in the mud, a jury of the whole. Vale was a man who hated rhetoric. He wanted facts. Reverend Hollister, state your case, and be brief. May presented the newspaper, the editorial, the summons. We claim the Copper Star Railway, aided by Marshal Carleton, has illegally seized water rights guaranteed by treaty. Hearsay. Pike scoffed. And a stolen map. Not stolen, Your Honor. Tallulah said. She stepped forward. It is from my family's box, and it is not just a map. It is the truth. Do you have this map? Vale asked. We have something better. Jonah said. He was still in cuffs. We have a photograph of it. Bela Novak stepped forward, his hands trembling, and presented the glass plate to the judge. Vale held it up to the gray, afternoon light. The image was perfect, a negative of the truth. He could see the lines, the seal. His eyes narrowed. This is compelling, Vale said. He looked at Pike. Mr. Pike, I assume the Copper Star has its own surveys, ledgers. I demand you produce them now. For comparison. Pike's composure finally cracked. That is proprietary information I will not— You will, Vale snapped. Or I will hold you in contempt and impound every spike and rail in this territory. Get the books. Pike had no choice. He sent a man running. While they waited, Vale heard testimony. Mr. Henderson of the public well, the ranchers. They spoke of the water, how it had always been, how it was changing. The books arrived. Heavy, leather-bound ledgers. Vale opened the survey book. He opened the map. He held the glass plate beside them. They are different, Vale said, his voice dangerous. Your map, Mr. Pike, seems to have rerouted the Three Sisters Creeks by almost 2 miles. A surveyor's error, Pike insisted. An error that benefits your pumping station. Vale said. This is preposterous, Carleton exploded. He could see it slipping away. I am the law here, this is my town. I am the one who maintains order. Order, May's voice was quiet, but it cut like a razor. What order is this? Marshal? She stepped forward and handed Judge Vale a second, smaller ledger, a carbon copy paybook she had borrowed from the railroad office. I found this, Your Honor, she said. It seems to be a list of guards hired by the Copper Star. Vale read the names. Silver Concho, Scar-cheek. These are known troublemakers. Indeed, May said. And the last line, a monthly payment, 10% of the total, paid to SC for consulting, paid out of the railroad's private security fund. Vale looked at Seth Carlton. The marshal's face was purple. 10%, Marshal Vale asked, his voice deadly quiet. Is that the going rate for selling the law? Carlton, trapped, his lies exposed, his graft laid bare, looked at Pike. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Jonah. And his hand dropped. Not to his gun, but to the hilt of his knife. He was a rat in a trap. And he was about to start chewing. The platform was a bomb of silence, waiting to explode. Judge Vale's words, 10% Marshal, hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Elliot Pike did not wait for the explosion. He saw the end. He saw the ledgers, the judge's iron-gray eyes, the grim, satisfied set of May Hollister's jaw. The law had failed him. The money had failed him. He was a ruined man, unless he could change the terms. In the stunned, absolute silence of the crowd, Pike moved. He was not a fighter, but he was a cornered animal. He lunged, not at Jonah, not at Tallulah, but at the one person who was both a weapon and a shield. He grabbed May Hollister, pulling her from the platform, his arm a steel bar across her throat. "No!" Tallulah screamed. Pike had his pistol out, jammed against May's temple. "Back off, all of you. Back off, Carlton." Seeing his only escape, reacted. "Don't move. Judge, the man's desperate." He used the moment to put his own back to the wall, creating a standoff. "The plate!" Pike yelled, his voice a raw, cracking shriek. He was dragging May toward his horse, which was still tied to the rail. "The glass plate! Give it to me, or she dies right here!" He was fumbling with the reins, his eyes wide and white. Scar-cheek, his last loyal man, had his own gun out, covering the crowd. "Let her go, Pike!" Jonah's voice was a low growl. The blacksmith, seeing the shift, had taken a hammer to the cuffs. Jonah was free. "The plate!" Pike screamed again. He shoved May onto his horse, leaping up behind her. "Devil's span, bring me the plate, or I'll send her to hell from there. You have 1 hour." He kicked the horse, Scar-cheek mounting his own, and they tore out of town, a cloud of mud and curses. "Jonah, no, it's a trap," Tallulah said, grabbing his arm. "It's May," he said. He was already running toward their own horses, tied near the church. "He's lost. A man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing on earth." They mounted, Tallulah swinging onto her mare. They did not take the road. They cut straight through the low cactus hills, a shortcut that would be harder, but faster. The sun, which had been hidden by the gray clouds of the hearing, broke through, a sudden, blinding, merciless glare. The heat was like a physical blow. The air, sharp and bright, made the distant, skeletal railway bridge at Devil's Span look impossibly clear and impossibly far. They rode through the Ocotillo and Cholla, the sharp spines tearing at their legs, the glare of the sun like hot needles in their eyes. Devil's Span was a monument to hubris, a spindly, black iron trestle built for the Copper Star Line. It crossed a 200-foot deep, dry canyon. The wind never stopped here. It shrieked through the beams, a constant, high-pitched wail, when Jonah and Tallulah arrived, skidding their horses to a halt in the loose rock of the embankment. The scene was already set. Pike had dragged May to the center of the bridge. She was tied, her back pressed against a thick steel support beam, her gray hair ripped from its bun, whipping across her face in the wind. "You're too late for the deal," Pike shouted, his voice thin against the gale. Then they saw it. Beside him, on the tracks, was a wooden crate. Dynamite. Wires ran from it to a small, crude detonator. "He's mad," Tallulah breathed. "He's desperate," Pike screamed, as if hearing her. "The glass plate." "Throw it to me." As if on cue, a new sound joined the wind. From down the tracks, a long, mournful whistle. The weekly water train, heavy with cistern cars, was on its way. "The plate!" Pike shrieked. "Or the bridge, the train." and your friend all go up. I'll ruin this railroad before I let you have it." Jonah and Tallulah looked at each other. They had the real plate, wrapped in cloth, in Jonah's saddlebag, but in Tallulah's hand, she held the decoy, the leather-wrapped fake she had made at May's. "I can't throw it that far," Tallulah shouted back, her voice torn by the wind. "I have to bring it. No tricks," Pike yelled. "No tricks," Tallulah said. She looked at Jonah. It was a look of absolute, terrifying trust. He nodded. "Once." Tallulah stepped out onto the bridge, her boots uncertain on the open ties, the wind whipping her clothes. "I'm coming." Pike's eyes were on her. He did not see Jonah Rook, his rifle left behind, slip over the edge of the embankment. Jonah was not a man built for heights, but he was a man built of iron. He swung down, his hands grabbing the cold, dusty lattice of the support beams. He was under the bridge, the canyon floor a dizzying, sickening drop below. The wind tore at him, trying to rip him from his hold. He put his cattle knife between his teeth, his eyes fixed on the center span. He began to crawl, hand over hand. A spider in the iron web. Above. Tallulah walked. Each step was a battle. The wind, the height. Pike was 20 yards away, his pistol aimed at her chest. May was behind him, her eyes closed, her lips moving in what looked like a prayer. "That's far enough," Pike shouted. "Throw it! The wind!" Tallulah cried. "It'll break." She held the leather-wrapped decoy. She had a coil of rope on her shoulder, as if she planned to lower it. At that exact moment, a new figure appeared on the far bank. Seth Carleton. He had broken free in the chaos, and his face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. He saw Tallulah on the bridge, Pike and May. He scanned the scene, and then his eyes looked down. He saw Jonah. Jonah was 10 feet from the dynamite, his hands and shirt torn, his arms screaming. He was exposed, a perfect hanging target. Carleton smiled. He raised his heavy Colt revolver, taking slow, deliberate aim. "Drop it, Marshal." The voice was not Jonah's. It was Mr. Henderson, the well owner. Carleton spun. He was not alone. The embankment was lined with them. The blacksmith, the ranchers, the shopkeepers. They had followed. They were not armed, except for the shovels, the hammers, the axes of their trade, but their faces were set, and they were done. "It's over, Carleton," Henderson said, holding a heavy wrench. Carleton looked at the dozen faces. He looked at his pistol. He looked at the long drop. His authority was gone. His 10% was gone. He let the pistol fall, its clatter lost in the wind. On the bridge, the drama climaxed. "Now damn you!" Pike screamed. The train whistle was a shriek. The train was visible, rounding the last bend. "Here!" Tallulah yelled. She held out the decoy. Then, as if the wind had ripped it from her, she fumbled it. The leather-wrapped package dropped. It did not fall into the canyon. It fell onto the tracks, rolling to a stop. "No!" Pike screamed, and his greed, his final, fatal flaw, took over. He lunged, not for Tallulah, but for the package. He forgot the wind, forgot the open ties. His foot slipped. He did not fall. He caught himself, his hands grabbing the rail, his body swinging out over the abyss. He was dangling, his pistol gone, his hands white on the iron. "Help me!" he shrieked. "Please help me!" Tallulah stood over him. The wind tore at her. She looked down at the man who had tried to kill her, who had terrorized her family, who was now a begging, pathetic creature. She reached her hand down. Pike's eyes widened, hope flooding his face. He reached up, and Tallulah pulled her hand back. She closed it into a fist. She did not push him. She did not strike him. She simply watched him. She would not be his executioner, but she would not be his savior. Below, the train's brakes were screaming. A high-pitched, metallic shriek as the wheels locked. Sparks showered the canyon. Jonah, seeing Pike fall, had reached the dynamite. He did not bother with the fuse. He found the 2 wires leading from the crate to the detonator, and with a single, brutal slash of his cattle knife, he cut them. The train! The train! Its great black engine panting, screeched to a halt. Its metal cowcatcher stopped not 5 inches from the inert box of dynamite. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the wind. Jonah pulled himself up onto the tracks, his hands bloody. Tallulah was already at May's side, her own knife out, cutting the ropes. May fell forward, not into a faint, but into Tallulah's arms, her entire body shaking in a single, silent hug. On the side of the bridge, Elliot Pike looked at the woman who would not save him. He looked at the train that had not exploded. He looked at the canyon floor, so far below. His will, his anger, his Eastern money had all evaporated. There was nothing left. He could not even find the strength to be angry. He was just empty. He let go. He fell. A small, dark thing, turning over and over, until the sand of the dry riverbed took him. On the bank, the ranchers, seeing it was over, grabbed Carlton. They used his own new manila rope to bind his hands. Jonah walked over to Tallulah. She was shaking, but she was standing. He looked at the spot where Pike had been. He looked at the ranchers tying up the last of the threat. He looked at Tallulah, her face smudged with dirt, her hair wild, her eyes clear. "We chose justice," he said, his voice rough, not revenge. Tallulah looked at the train, the engineer white-faced in the cab. She looked at May, breathing deep. She looked at the ranchers, who had come not for a fight, but to stand with them. She nodded, her hand finding his, and survival. For all of us. The walk back from Devil's Span was not a march of triumph. It was a slow, quiet, and weary procession. The sun, having broken through for the battle, now softened, slanting low across the high desert, turning the wet, red rock into a deep, bruised purple. The air was clean, washed by the storm, and smelled of creosote and damp earth. They returned to the train depot, which was no longer a scene of conflict, but a makeshift court, bathed in the calm, forgiving light of the late afternoon. The town was still there, a silent, standing jury. Judge Horace Vale, his face grim, resumed his seat on the crate of spikes. He had seen the end, but the law required the punctuation. Seth Carlton stood before him, his hands bound by his own rope, his face a mask of gray. Sullen defeat. He was no longer a marshal. He was just a man in a wet duster. "Seth Carlton." Judge Vale's thin voice cut through the silence. "You have betrayed your oath. You have conspired to defraud the citizens of this territory. And you have aided in an act of violent extortion. By the authority vested in me, I hereby strip you of your badge, your title, and your authority." Vale nodded to Mr. Henderson, who stepped forward. Henderson did not rip the badge from Carlton's chest. He methodically, almost sadly, unpinned the tin star and handed it to the judge. It was a quiet, devastating, and procedural end. "As for Elliot Pike," Vale continued, his voice hardening, "I am signing the warrant for his arrest on charges of kidnapping, attempted murder, and the willful destruction of corporate and public property. He fell, Your Honor," Tallulah said, her voice quiet. "From the bridge." A murmur went through the crowd. "Then God will be his judge," Vale said, signing the paper nonetheless. "But his employer, the Copper Star Railway, will be judged by me. We will reconvene in the morning to assess damages and penalties." But the real judgment had already been passed by the town. As the hearing broke, people did not rush to the saloon. They gathered in small, quiet groups. They looked at the glass plate, which Bella Novak had propped against a post, the negative image of the map catching the golden light. They looked at Tallulah's own hand-drawn copy, and they looked at the railroad's false ledger, both now sitting side by side on the platform. The evidence was clear, tangible, and undeniable. They nodded, one by one. A slow, communal acceptance. The truth had been made visible. Judge Vale's final ruling, delivered the next morning, was just the ink on the page. The water rights of the Three Sisters Creeks were affirmed, belonging to the Greyhawk estate, to be held in trust for the community, as Tallulah's father had wished. The public well, by Henderson's petition, was placed under the protection of the town council, not the marshal's office. And the Copper Star Railway, its reputation in tatters, was ordered to build its own reservoir, a mile downstream, and to pay a heavy, punitive fee into the town's public fund for its reckless endangerment of the populace. May Hollister's press ran all night. The morning edition of the Meridian Bell was not a single sheet. It was 4 pages, with the full text of Judge Vale's ruling on the front page, beneath a banner headline, "The Law of Water." But it was the inside page that people would keep. Bela Novak, who had seen his art become evidence, had developed his other photos. He had strung a line between 2 posts of the church porch, but instead of the grim, morbid portraits of hanged men, as was so common, he hung his new glass plates to dry in the sun. It was a new kind of gallery. There was Pike, his face a mask of rage, burning the newspapers. There was the crowd, standing against the armed guards. There was Jonah, his hands still cuffed, being led by May as she read the law. It was not a gallery of death. It was a gallery of justice, a record of a town that had stood up. The change in Fort Meridian was not loud. It was a quiet, steady thing, like water finding its level. The day after the ruling, Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, and 2 ranchers from the crowd showed up at the schoolhouse. They were not talking. They were working, using lumber and pipe paid for by the new public fund. They began to build a long, clean, communal water trough with a new brass tap that a child could turn. When they were done, the schoolteacher let the children out, and they ran to the tap, their hands outstretched. Their laughter, clear and bright in the afternoon air, was the first new sound of the town's future. Jonah Rook spent that afternoon in his own yard. He had gone out to the patch of land where the survey stake, the one he had broken, still lay. He pulled the 2 pieces from the hard earth. He did not burn them. He took them to the small, fallow patch of ground behind his cabin, the one that had been his wife's garden. He drove the stakes deep, using them as the end posts for a new, small fence. When Tallulah found him, he was on his knees, turning the soil. "It's good land," he said, not looking up. "It just needs water and tending." "What are you planting?" she asked. "Yucca," he said, gesturing to the small plant he had brought from the line cabin. "For salve." He looked up at her, his pale eyes clear. "And other things. Whatever you want." The next day, Seth Carlton was put on the eastbound stage, in chains, to be delivered to the federal prison. His power was a memory. And at the depot, a private rail car, heavily curtained, had arrived. Inside, Elliot Pike, who had not died, but who had landed on a deep, forgiving bank of sand. His will and his arrogance shattered, was signing his name. His fall had been 200 feet, and it had broken nothing but his spirit. He signed the confession, a full account of the conspiracy, in exchange for the Copper Star Railway's quiet promise to protect the bridge, and its own name, from further scandal. He was a broken tool, being shipped back east in a box. On the 3rd day, Tallulah Greyhawk walked from Jonah's ranch into town. She did not go to the bank or the general store. She went to the small, boarded-up building that had been her family's original trading post. She took a hammer and a pry bar and, with a sound of screeching nails, pulled the boards from the windows. She spent the day cleaning. She swept out the nests of pack rats, the layers of dust, the memories of abandonment. By evening, it was a clean, empty room, smelling of soap and new possibilities. She had a sign, which the blacksmith had helped her paint. She hung it over the door. The new, black letters stark on the fresh white wood. It said, "House of Clear Water," and in smaller letters beneath community store reading room. Jonah found her on the porch as the sun was setting, the sky a magnificent, peaceful blaze of orange and violet. She was washing the last of the dust from the front window. He stood there for a long moment, just watching her. She was not a victim he had rescued. She was a woman he had stood with. He had something in his hand. He had worked on it for 2 days, in the forge. not with new metal, but by melting down the silver concho he had taken from the saddle of Pike's man. He had hammered it, cooled it, and polished it. It was not a perfect, delicate thing. It was a simple, thick band of silver, strong and marked by the hammer, but solid. He held it out. It lay on his calloused, dirty palm. It was not a proposal. It was a fact. "The cabin is too small," Jonah said, his voice rough. "And the winters are cold. Alone." Tallulah stopped washing. She looked at the ring. She looked at his face, at the lines around his eyes that were, for the first time, not lines of grief, but of quiet, settled peace. "Will you stay?" he asked. It was the simplest and most complex question he had ever asked. She did not take the ring. She did not speak. She put down her rag, stepped off the small porch, and closed the distance between them. She put her arms around his waist, laying her head against his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart. He was real. This was real. Her own arms, strong from the work, held him tight. He wrapped his own around her, his hand burying itself in her long, clean hair. It was an embrace not of desperate need, as in the cave, but of deliberate choice. She tilted her head back, her eyes, which were wet, shining in the dusk. "Stay," she said, her voice thick, her hand finally closing over his, over the ring, over the future, and build. The sunset over Coyote Step was a final, peaceful fire, a stark difference from the blood-red dawn that had started this. It poured a thick honey-gold light over the new tin roof of the House of Clear Water. The wind, coming down from the high ridges, had lost its sharp, sand-toothed bite. It was a clean wind, carrying the scent of dry, cut grass and the promise of a distant, gentle rain. Jonah Rook and Tallulah Greyhawk walked the line of the newly cleared irrigation ditch. The water, diverted clean and cold from the Three Sisters creeks, ran with a low, steady music, a sound of life in the high desert. Their horses, Ghost and the little mare, walked with them, their heads bent low to drink from the flow. The surface of the water was a perfect, shattered mirror of the deep, purple twilight sky. They did not speak. In the days since the trial, they had learned a new quiet. It was not the empty, hollow silence of grief Jonah had known, nor the tense, watchful silence Tallulah had been forced to keep. It was the full, heavy silence of shared work, of a peace that had been fought for and won. They stopped at the edge of the ranch, where the main ditch met the public well. Mr. Henderson and the blacksmith had spent 2 days hauling a large, flat slab of red sandstone from the bluff. They had chiseled into it. It was not a gravestone for the dead. It was a marker for the living. It listed the names of those who had stood at the depot: Greyhawk, Rook, Hollister, Novak, Henderson. And beneath the names, a single, deep-cut line: "They kept the water." Jonah looked at his own name, carved into the stone of a land he had tried to erase himself from. He had come here to be a ghost, and the world had insisted on making him real. Tallulah's hand, which had been resting on his arm, slid down. Her fingers, calloused now from the work of rebuilding the shop, intertwined with his. It was a simple, solid, possessive gesture. His hand, scarred and rough, closed around hers. They stood there for a long moment, their heads bowed, in a shared, silent gratitude. Across the street, a lamp was lit in the window of the Meridian Bell. May Hollister was not setting type. She was hanging a frame. She had taken the front page of her special edition, the one with Judge Vale's ruling, and had it framed in dark, heavy oak. She hung it in the window for all to see. The headline was a promise, a new creed for the town public water, public heart. The West still has people. Bella Novak, it turned out, was not leaving. The town, he had decided, had a dramatic chiaroscuro that his art required. He had insisted on one last photograph before he packed his chemicals. He had gathered them on the porch of the new shop, a tableau of the town's new center. Jonah and Tallulah stood at the heart of it, not posing, not stiffly arranged, but simply standing as they were. His hand rested on the small of her back, a quiet, protective gesture. May was beside them, her arms crossed, a rare, thin smile on her face. Henderson, the well owner, the blacksmith, and the school teacher with 2 of her children had all crowded in. "Hold! Still!" Bela had instructed, his head vanishing under the black cloth. "Do not breathe. Do not think." They stood, looking at the strange brass eye of the camera, and for the first time, no one was looking away. Their eyes were not defiant, or afraid, or haunted. They were clear. They were present. They were looking straight ahead. The flash of magnesium was a small, bright sun, a burst of white fire that captured them all, freezing them not as individuals, but as a community. The love between them was like that photograph. It was not a loud, dramatic thing. It was a quiet fact, developed in darkness and brought into the light. It was in the small, unconscious gestures. It was in the way Jonah came to stand beside her when she struggled with a heavy crate of books for the new reading room, his shoulder brushing hers, his strength supporting her without a word. It was in the way Tallulah, seeing him staring at the empty peg on the cabin wall, the one that had held his wife's memory, had quietly hung a new, clean coil of rope there, replacing the ghost with a tool for the future. It was in the small, shared laughs late at night as they stacked shelves, their hands brushing as they both reached for the same tattered copy of Shakespeare. It was a touch on the arm, a shared cup of coffee in the pre-dawn cold, the simple, unspoken promise of "I am here." That evening, in the new, clean quiet of the shop, Tallulah sat at the front counter. She had a new, heavy, leather-bound book. It was the store's ledger, but it was also the town's. On the first page, she had written the name of the first child who had used the new public tap. Now, on the last page, she dipped a steel-nibbed pen into a bottle of fresh, black ink. She paused, thinking. Jonah watched her, the lamplight catching the silver ring on her hand. She wrote, her script clear and strong. Justice is not always the sound of a gunshot. Sometimes it is the quiet strike of a match. Sometimes it is the law spoken aloud in a dusty street. And sometimes it is just a reflection, held steady, on a wet glass plate. She closed the book, the final word written. Jonah turned to the small, pot-bellied stove they had installed in the corner. The night was cold, and a fire was needed. In his hand, he held a short, stiff length of manila rope. It was the piece he had cut from the broken survey stake, the one that had been left in his yard as a threat. He had carried it in his pocket, a cold reminder. He held it over the open grate. He looked at the rope, the symbol of the violence that had hunted him, the violence he had run from. He looked at Tallulah, at the peaceful, determined set of her jaw as she read a book by the new light. He had made his choice. He dropped the rope into the flames. The fibers caught instantly, curling, turning from a threat into a dark, brittle ash. It was not a sacrifice. It was a release. The ashes, light and meaningless, were drawn up the stovepipe, disappearing into the night. The pointless, empty violence was over, as if to mark the moment. A new sound rolled across the cooling desert. From the white steeple of the church, the bell began to ring. It was not the slow, 3-beat toll of danger, nor the frantic, single ring of alarm. It was a steady, rhythmic, evening peal. May Hollister was ringing the vespers. It was the sound of peace, of order, of a day's work done. In the shop, Tallulah stood and lit the new oil lamp that hung on a brass hook by the door. She trimmed the wick, and the light grew warm and golden. It spilled out through the clean, new glass, onto the porch and into the dark street. It was not a light to ward off enemies. It was a light to welcome friends. It was an invitation to everyone, an invitation to come in, to read, to learn, and to drink the clean, clear water. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Drop a comment below, tell us your city or your town, and share your thoughts on Jonah and Tallulah's stand. If you believe in these stories, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and like this video. It helps our small community grow. And one last thing, if you can. Press that hype button, so this story of holding on and of clear water can be heard by more folks who need it.